Our lecture is going to be on traces of Vastu that we find in historic and ancient buildings and cities in the Western Hemisphere. We're going to have another talk by a wonderful Vastu architect from Peru about traces of Vastu that we find in South America. And I look forward to that. It should be quite stimulating. Wojtek Skalski is one of the earliest Maharishi Vastu architects, and he has built Maharishi Vastu buildings extensively in Nepal and also in Russia and Eastern Europe and France and Poland and Scandinavia. So he's really a global architect, and he's very learned. And he's always had a special interest in the traces that we can find of Vastu in buildings and cities around the world. And that's what he's going to be talking about. Now, when I say traces, what I mean is that we don't know whether there may or may not be any actual direct historical connection between any of the buildings and cities that we show and Vastu, this tradition of natural law-based architecture as it has been preserved in Vedic India. Probably in most cases, there is absolutely no historical connection. And so it would not be correct to call the many examples that we show today Vastu. Rather, they are buildings and cities that contain some of the elements of Vastu. And that's something that Wojtek will explore. It's quite a fascinating subject, and I hope you enjoy it.
Thank you very much for inviting me to this great seminar. The subject is really fascinating. When I first heard about Maharishi Vastu in late 80s, I immediately looked into books on history of architecture and city planning. And I was amazed to see so many examples of buildings that we all know, which are oriented according to cardinal directions, and especially those buildings which are oriented to perfectly towards east. And there are also plenty of ancient cities on all continents which are oriented according to cardinal directions. Their grid of streets is oriented to cardinal directions. So let's see a few slides with examples of those traces of Vastu. So let's start with the three main principles of Maharishi Vastu or Maharishi Vedic architecture. And these are proper orientation towards east or sometimes towards north. And proper orientation means precise orientation within a degree or two. Proper room placement or proper layout of cities, and then proper dimensions and proportions. So first, east orientation. East orientation is justified or explained in Vastu as orientation which brings revitalizing power of sunrise. When the sun rises in the morning, all nature wakes up, flowers open up, birds start singing, and we all get vitality. We start our activities during the day. And then in the evening, when sun sets, everything is getting more rested and slower, and then goes to sleep, the whole nature. So we follow the same influences, the energies of rising sun and setting sun when designing the buildings. And then the other reason for Eastern orientation is looking in the direction of Earth rotation. And then there is a validation from ancient cultures, which we'll see today in many examples. And then aligning walls with order of the cosmos, which means walls are following the direction of Earth's rotation, and north and south pole. And then there is already some scientific evidence, scientific research showing that orienting buildings according to Vastu really creates positive effects. To many people, it is surprising to hear that the word orientation is related with the word oriens, which in Greek means sunrise or east. And architects, all architects are orienting their buildings, and they understand orientation means that we show the arrow of north in the plans, and that's it. But few architects are aware of the fact that orientation means connecting the building with east, and not just with any direction. And here is one example of east-oriented, famous east-oriented building. It's St. Peter Cathedral in Vatican. So it is oriented perfectly towards east, and it has been also part, or east orientation has been also a part of a tradition in Christianity. When we visited St. Peter's Cathedral, I asked the priest who was a guide for tourists, I asked about East orientation, the meaning of East orientation, and he said East symbolizes, represents resurrection. The life is waking up together with morning sun. So we honor East through orientation. And this is the front picture of St. Peter's Cathedral. And this is another example. This is from Krakow, Poland. Krakow was built about 1,000 years ago, and the grid of the streets, as you can see, is rotated. It's not following cardinal directions. But the church, St. Mary Church, the most important church in Krakow, is built exactly on the axis east to west, so that the altar can be on the east side and everybody in the church faces east together with priest. This was the principle in early Christianity. And for that reason, the church, the builders of the church didn't follow the direction of streets, but they followed cardinal directions. And then you can see there is another small church built later in Renaissance time at the bottom left with a square chapel, which is also following cardinal directions and not the direction of street. So that means they were aware of the importance of orientation. And this is Pantheon in Rome, a famous building in the center of Rome, built in the times before Christ. It is based on a square and circle and oriented towards north, precisely towards north, with an opening in the dome in the center, which connects the central point of the structure with heaven. In Vastu, we are talking about Brahmastan, the center of every structure, which we mark in the floor. And we also connect the center of the building with an opening above it, with some cupola or little tower or window above in the roof. And here's a quote from a book on Christian liturgy from previous Pope Benedictus, where he talks about orientation. And he talks about orientation on about 10 different pages, coming back again and again to the importance of orientation. For example, he says, modern man has little understanding of the orientation. That is why, wherever possible, we should definitely take up again the apostolic tradition of facing east, both in the buildings of churches and in the celebration of liturgy. So this shows that Vastu is not something known only in India or invented in India, but similar principles were understood also in European tradition. And the concept of connecting the center of the building with heaven, like we have seen in the example of Pantheon. This is the cupola or dome of St. Peter's Church. You see that it has over the central point where the altar is, there is connection with heaven and the light descending from the top. And this is a mandala pattern which we use, or which has been used also in other traditions for Vastu design. It can be based on square or elongated square, which means rectangle. And this is our diagram showing that different corners or area of the building, according to its orientation, are suitable for different room placement. That means that there are different laws of nature or different impulses of creative intelligence lively in different parts of the building. And we plan the house or the layout of rooms accordingly. This is a Buddhist mandala called Kala Chakra mandala. This is an example from Tibet. You can see that it has a central point, it has 4 gates, and it is shown as a little concentric city structure with walls around the central point. And mandala means circle or combination of circles and squares. And traditionally in the East, mandala were a diagram symbolizing cosmic order for cardinal directions, for phases of the day, for seasons of the year, for colors, for powers, and so, and anything that was 4 or 8, because the corners were also considered. And the idea in mandalas was that every direction represents or brings into the building different energy or different laws of nature, different qualities. And those who have studied the history of city planning certainly have studied the principle of ancient Roman cities. Ancient Roman city was always planned according to cardinal directions. They put a peg first in the center of the city, and then they plowed with an ox ditch from east to west, which was the beginning of a street or marking the line of the street called Decumanus. And then the other street from north to south was called Cardo. And then parallel to those 2 lines, they were creating other streets, and then rectangular fence or wall around it with gates from 4 directions. So this is the principle of a diagram for plans of planning cities in Europe. And here is an example from medieval city in Florence. And you can see that in the center, the grid of streets is perfectly regular and according to cardinal directions. In all the examples that I'm showing, the north is at the top, and this red triangle in top right corner indicates always north. So the streets are following cardinal directions, and you can see also that the cathedral, which is in the top right area, also follows cardinal directions. It's similarly like in Krakow. It has altar on the east side. Entrances were from the west or from sides, but for the purpose of having all the congregation facing east. And then you can see also an interesting phenomenon from this example, that the core of medieval cities were based on a regular grid of streets, and most often oriented according to cardinal directions. But then with time, other streets or development of the city didn't follow anymore this principle. That means that the knowledge, the meaning of Eastern orientation was lost. And now I'll show quickly many examples of mandala patterns, which were the basis of cities. And here we should mention Vastu Purusha Mandala, which is a mandala diagram from Vastu tradition, from Vastu scriptures, which tells architects and city planners how to place different rooms and how to place different functions in the city based on a mandala pattern. So this is Bangalore in India, and these cities always have the central square or park, so the center is open. This is Mandalay city in Myanmar or Burma. So even the name of the city indicates that it was based on a mandala. And streets are also following cardinal directions. This is Peterhof, a summer palace of a Tsar outside of St. Petersburg. And you can see that it is also perfectly oriented towards cardinal directions on the grid. And the garden is based on a beautiful mandala with a central Brahmastan. It has a water fountain in the center. This is an example from Poland, a city built 200 or 300 years ago, also on mandala, based on mandala pattern, and also oriented according to cardinal directions. That means that all the streets are following cardinal directions, and there is a park in the center. Here is Beijing, the capital city of China, the Forbidden City, the palace of the empire. And as you can see, the city center is also based on a grid which is oriented according to cardinal direction. And you might have heard that in China, a similar tradition to Vastu was followed, called feng shui. Maybe I'll ask Jon to say more about it. He knows about feng shui and about China more than I do. So
thanks, Wojtek. As I look at this site plan of the Forbidden City, a couple of things come to my mind. One is that what is not visible in this photograph, but just above it, is a hill. And on that hill were buried the ancestors of the emperors of earlier dynasties, when this had been a capital previously. And when the third Ming emperor, he called himself the second, but really the third, decided to move the capital of China away from Nanjing. Nan means south, Bei means north. So he moved it from the traditional southern capital to the northern capital in order to establish his own power, because in the prior dynasty, the Yuan dynasty, the capital had been located in the south. He located it, and China traditionally was focused entirely upon ancestor worship. And it was thought that through the ancestors and through the emperor and through the emperor, who were understood to be descended from the sun, that we could connect ourselves with the sun through worshiping the emperor and the emperor's ancestors. And so he placed the new city that he built, the Forbidden City, his own complex, immediately south of this great hill where the ancestral emperors had been buried, so that his palace would face it and face it to the north, making that auspicious connection. Much of the commerce coming to Beijing, coming to the emperor, was coming from the south, was coming from Nanjing and Tibet, etc. And so a southern entrance became very trafficked. And when we visit the Forbidden City today, chances are we approach it from the south, but it's important to note that historically this northern entrance was important to it. And this spills over into the subject of feng shui, which Wojtek mentioned, which I can address just for a minute. I've talked about it on an earlier webinar if you want to learn in any detail. I have lectured to groups of Chinese architects and done work in China. And so I've done quite a bit of studying on the history of Chinese architecture. And based on all of that, what I have been told is that everything that we say, everything that Wojtek has said about Maharishi Vastu is completely accepted by the masters of feng shui, including the primary orientation to the east. And then the question comes up, well, if we know only one thing about feng shui, what we've heard is that it prefers a southern orientation. How does that come to be? And what a professor of feng shui at China's most prestigious architecture university said to me is, well, it's simply because Beijing is pretty far north and it has a cold winter and the sun spends most of the winter time in the southern hemisphere. And so people who want to have a connection to the sun think that they can get it by having their buildings face south. And so this grew up. However, what we really understand in the core feng shui doctrine is that the ideal for connection to the sun and support of natural law is a connection to the east.
Thank you. That was a very interesting part of information. I could add here, you probably talked about it earlier, that in Feng Shui, there is also the idea that each direction, each cardinal direction brings different influences, or different laws of nature are lively in different directions. And this is a similarity with Vastu. And of course, the idea of connecting the structure with heaven, with heavenly order.
We can see all of the primary elements of Vastu also occur in feng shui, raising the possibility that there is this strong historical connection in both traditions. Masters in both traditions have told me that feng shui descends from Vastu, though we can't know based on historical records, only on memory. But the application of these principles, just as the application of orientation, tends to vary today in feng shui from that of Vastu. And this happens inevitably over the passage of time.
Thank you. This is an example from India, and not from Hindu tradition, but from Muslim tradition. Agra Taj Mahal, everybody knows what is Taj Mahal. And there's even a picture in the top right corner. And it has been oriented also precisely towards cardinal directions. And it has a mandala structure. The garden is based on a mandala with a nice central Brahma standpoint. And also Taj Mahal, which is at the top here. The building itself is based on mandala and also has the cupola in the center, and many principles of Vastu are present there. And another surprising example, it's a small village in Brazil, which Dr. Hartmann has found in Google Earth. And it is oriented perfectly towards cardinal directions and has the principles of ancient Roman city with this grid of streets, and it also has a little garden in the center, in the central point. And concentric structures are also part of Vastu. They are not round like here, but the concentric squares. But here are examples of cosmic structures which are concentric. Actually, these are not cosmic structures, these are atomic structures. The next will be cosmic structures, because as is the atom, so is the universe, Vedas say. So every atom and every cell represents the same principles as the cosmos. Every flower has a central point and it grows from the center, and it is symmetric into many directions. And the central point, which is called Brahmastan in Vastu, represents the center of creative power of nature, the absolute. This is an interesting example from Scandinavian tradition. Edda is a mythology of Vikings. Edda and Veda even sound similar. And in Edda, they are describing an Asgard, which is a symbol of paradise or heavenly city or country on earth. And as you can see, this is a painting from a French artist who has illustrated it. It has 4 gates. It is an island with 4 gates and a river coming from the center, from the central point, the Brahmastan, which is the source of creativity, and they flow into 4 cardinal directions. They have a round gate around a wall around, and they have a tree of life in the center. And this tree connects the life on earth with heavenly order. You can see that there are the orbits of stars and sun and moon, which are, this structure is reflected also in the earthly structure of Asgard, the paradise. Here the floor plans from Renaissance time and earlier. Palladio, who is the father of modern or classical architecture, he was an Italian architect in Renaissance time. He represents very much this principle of mandala in Western architecture, and his plan of his villa is here in the center at the top, based on square. And then Stonehenge, which is a structure, we'll show a photograph later, the oldest architectural structure in Europe, in England, which has been astronomical instrument or observatory related to positions of sun in different time of the year, is at the bottom right. And then the other building, the one at the top right, is Borobudur from Java. We'll also see photograph of that. The one at the bottom center is one of the palaces in Delhi. And then those on the right side or the left side are plans of temples in Renaissance Italy. So they all have symmetry in 4 directions, or even more if in some cases, eight direction symmetry. They all have empty center, as you can see, and they are all based on a mandala diagram. This is an example from Helsinki, our capital city. You can see that the cathedral which was built about 200-300 years ago, is also based on mandala, on a square with the central cupola above, and 4 cardinal directions are followed. The whole city center from that time was following, or is still following, cardinal directions. So the grid is following proper orientation, and it has the main square with a Brahmastan marked in the center with a monument of emperor, and it has on the north side cathedral, on the east side the main government, building of government, the seat of government. On the south it's the town hall, and on the west side is the main building of the university. So like 4 most important powers or institutions in the city were placed around this square. And this is an example, it's a theoretical design of a Vastu village showing hierarchy. When we talk about reflecting cosmic order in Vastu architecture in cities or buildings, the first question comes why it is rectangular or squarish when structures in the universe are more round. So it's not about following the shapes, it's about the principles. So hierarchy, there is a hierarchy in the cosmos, in the universe. They are a cluster of galaxies, and then galaxies in each cluster, and then solar systems, and planets, and then Earth, and continents, and countries, and cities, and so on. And similarly, if we look at human body, human anatomy, we have, in the body, we have systems, we have organs, and in organs we have cells, and we have molecules in the cells, and atoms, and so on and so on. So the structure of the city, the composition or layout of the city is also based on hierarchy, bigger squares and smaller squares and smaller squares. And also you can see this principle of concentric structures, which is also a principle of the structure of cosmos. That design is theoretical and a bit rigid, you can say, but in reality, here is an example of a concrete project in Florida called Mandala Club, where you can make the feeling much softer. The streets are not so rigidly, but still all follow cardinal directions, and all buildings follow Eastern orientation. And there's also this principle of hierarchy. So the smaller squares and smaller centers within bigger structure. This was designed by Richard Bialowski, an American architect. Now, design reflecting cosmic order, just for summary, what does it mean following cosmic order? Cardinal directions, That means the way the Earth is rotating and North and South Pole are followed. So walls of each structure of each building and also all streets are in harmony with the structure or with the movement of the Earth. Concentric patterns, we talked about it. Hierarchy of structures, we talked about it. And then cosmic rhythms and proportions. There are rhythms in nature. We have lunar rhythms of 4 weeks. We have yearly rhythms. We have daily rhythms and so on. Weekly rhythms. And Vedic architecture applies mathematical principles that are based on those cosmic rhythms. Here an example of a concentric structure, which is well known to everybody, our solar system. And then here is a picture of a galaxy. And then in the top right corner, a picture of beryl atom, a refraction picture of beryl atom. And then a shell of a shrimp or snail, which also starts from the central point and grows from the Brahmastan. This is an example from Slavic tradition, from Poland and Ukraine and Slovakia and Croatia. There was this tradition of Svetovit, which is a Slavic totem with 4 faces, each face facing cardinal direction. These were from more than 1,000 years ago, before Christian time, from the time where Slavic nations were following natural religions and worshipping laws of nature. I just want to mention in relation to this picture that in the scripture on Vastu, the ancient scripture called Manasara, in one of the first sutras, it says about the Brahma having 4 faces, and each face, one face faces east, one west, one north and south. And then from one face, Vastu tradition came. So this is very nicely related to the subject. We should probably end with a very short summary about this presentation and about Maharishi Vastu, that what we are showing here are not all exactly principles of Maharishi Vastu, but traces of those principles. And we are showing that the knowledge of Vastu, even though it wasn't called Vastu, has been discovered and understood and applied on all continents thousands of years ago. And probably there was no communication at that time between India and those other continents, because this knowledge is universal. It's a question of laws of nature that were understood by different seers or different people, different wise masters of architecture and city planning. That's why they were applied in a similar way. So back to you, John.
Thank you very much, Wojtek. This was absolutely fascinating. And because of your Scandinavian and Eastern European background, you were able to describe examples that were utterly new to me, and I'm sure to virtually the rest of our audience. And it's beautiful to see that Vastu Sthapatya is nature's architecture, and you have helped to explain how that is really the case. And as such, the elements can be cognized spontaneously in different cultures and different traditions around the world. It is tempting to speculate that there is a historical influence, connection from Vedic culture to other cultures around the world. And certainly this may be the case, but we do not have much in the way of historical evidence of that. And so this other explanation, which is that anyone with a sufficiently pure nervous system may directly experience some of the organizing principles of nature's intelligence is another way of explaining how these principles arise again and again in the buildings, the cities, and the sculpture of the world's civilizations. Thank you for this wonderful introduction. And Celia, I understand some questions have come in. Let us turn it over to you.
Yes, we do have some questions. Before the invention of electricity and wristwatches, humans were more aware of the sun in their daily life. Do you think that is why they naturally oriented buildings to the rising sun?
Well, this could be one of the reasons, but I think it was more, as John mentioned, more related to their belief or respecting and worshipping sun as a god. This was the tradition in China, in Egypt, in India, in Japan, in South America. So there was probably a feeling and understanding that sun is the source of vitality, and there would be no life without sun. And for that reason, sun was respected, and everybody wanted to have the blessing of the morning sun by worshipping it and by doing Surya Namaskara, which is sun salutation, but also they wanted that their buildings are facing east and honoring east and benefiting from the blessing of rising sun.
Thank you. There's also a question asking, is there a place where we can learn the principles to make Vedic artworks?
Yes, Vedic artwork is also part of Vastu, especially sculptures and composition of paintings. And there are courses. I know that Meru, Maharishi European Research University, is organizing courses on Vedic architecture. So you would have to check on website of Maharishi European Research University.
Thank you. That would be wonderful. I thought Vastu preferred square and rectangular structures, but you also showed some circular structures, such as Stonehenge. How does that fit in?
Yes, I was explaining on examples that these round shapes, which are in nature, are showing the principle of concentric structures and principles of symmetry, but they are not applied as a shape for a building, because it's much more practical, first of all, to have straight walls. It's easier to organize the rooms and to furnish the rooms when they are rectangular. It's easier to structure a building when or build a building when it is rectangular. But the most important fact is that then the building's walls are in harmony with the direction of rotating of the Earth and with North and South Pole.
Wonderful. We have a comment from Bryce saying, fascinating webinar. Thank you. Where would be the best place to get more education about building design using these principles?
Well, for designing Maharishi Vastu, it's best to take courses offered by Maharishi Vastu, and this you can find on the website maharishivastu.org. If you want to learn more about these historical examples, just go to libraries and look into books on history of architecture and city planning, or go to internet. There are many examples there. And most of all, in Google Earth, when you travel from country to country and city to city, you will find many, many examples of buildings or towns that were oriented according to cardinal directions.
Yes, we have quite a number of trained Vastu architects now from around the world who have taken courses through Nehru. Is that correct?
Yes.
So there are courses offered for architects and trained designers to have this formal training from time to time they're given.
Yes.
We just got a question in from our beloved Wayne Foster in Victoria, BC. Hello, Wayne. And he wrote, beautiful entrance, beautiful presentation. And if the main entrance is east, each of the units inside can vary. And that is correct. The primary Eastern orientation influence of a building is from the way that you come and go into and out of the building rather than into and out of individual units.
Very good. So thank you. Just to summarize, Maharishi Vastu, as compared to other ancient traditions of architecture, we're not saying during this presentation that all the principles of Vastu are present in all the cultures. There are some traces, fragmented parts of the knowledge, either taken from India or discovered in those countries. But we are fortunate to have Maharishi Vastu and to offer and to use it all over the world, also on other continents, because it's holistic, it's an integrated knowledge, not fragmented, it's systematic, and this is due or thanks to Maharishi's revival of this knowledge about 30 years ago. He has made it structured and systematic. It includes also aspect of consciousness, and this was also Maharishi's input. It's a spiritual knowledge which has been connected with consciousness and enlightenment. Vastu is an architecture or the architecture for the enlightenment. And the element of consciousness is very important. It's based on preserved scriptures, which is also unique. All the other traditions about which we were talking have no scriptures on which their knowledge is based. It has been lost. It's Maharishi Vastu is practical. It's a scientific approach. It's not a belief, because we know that certain principles, when you apply them, you receive certain positive effects. And then it is applied globally, which is also unique. There are different systems of spiritual architecture, or even different systems of Vastu offered. And I think there is no other system which would have over 1,000 of buildings created during the last 30 years on all continents. So these were the final summary of this presentation. So thank you very much for inviting me. It was a great joy. We could, of course, talk more. There is a lot of interesting knowledge related to this subject.
Thank you so much, Wojtek. It's really terrific to hear an authority on a subject speak from his passion. And we're going to have Wojtek speak another time, a little bit later this year. He has more on this topic to talk to us about. There's another whole element of Vastu, which we find traces of in cultures around the world that, for lack of time, he didn't get to. So we'll look forward to that. A reminder, as Wojtek said a couple of times in the talk, that he is not, in his examples, showing Vastu, but he's showing how elements of Vastu have can be found very clearly in non-Vastu work that is found in different cultures around the world. For the holistic and completely effective result of proper Vastu, Maharishi Vastu, we would build directly using that tradition. So, Celia, over to you.
The thing that struck me watching this video, speaking of Wojtek speaking, is how fortunate we are, how lucky we are to have the full blossoming of Vastu knowledge and not just partial examples, a little bit, in this way or this way, but we are so fortunate to have true Vastu that we can live in and be protected in and blossom and thrive in.
Nicely put.
We have one question here from Keith. What about the classic Greek city structures?
Yes, of course, Wojtek did show the classic Roman city structure, which was a better one to show in this example because the Roman Empire established military camps throughout its empire, extending all the way well into England. And those were laid out almost always according to the principles of Vastu city planning, as he explained. And from those, through King Philip of Spain, they were picked up and also used in the layout of many of the important Spanish colonial cities founded in South America, Central America, and even on the west coast of the United States. And so it is the Roman city plan which has had vastly more influence in the world than the Greek city plan. But the Roman plan did come from Greece, although there is some question about that. There was another culture next to the city of Rome and extending to the north of it, which also had some of these elements. And it's not entirely certain to historians whether Roman city planning is primarily inspired by Greek or by this other Italian civilization. But we do see very similar elements in Periclean Greek city planning, which may not be a coincidence because Alexander the Great, who was Macedonian and a part of the Greek Empire, of course, when he was the emperor of Greece, extended his empire all the way to Hindustan, what we call India today. And it is recorded that he brought back with him wise men who had specialized knowledge from India to Greece to Macedonia. And so it is entirely possible that there actually is a direct historical influence from India to Greece and then to Rome and then across Europe and across the New World. So I've gone more than to simply answer your question, Keith, but there you are.